lands to where it stops moving. The way we do this is to simulate a several range of conditions. In this instance, the catapult is shown in its cocked position with plain pea gravel loaded on it. We're about to launch it onto this plywood target here. This plywood target kind of represents a geologic end member of a hard, non-erodible surface, like maybe a fresh lava flow that hasn't had yet a regolith develop on top of it yet. I can remove this plywood stage and replace it with these catchment buckets. This does not represent anything geological, but is necessary to establish the mass profile of the ejecta deposit before it has a chance to flow. That's very important. The theory that I mentioned before, it treats it as though ejecta stays exactly where it lands. Well, with this case, we can get it to stay exactly where it lands and measure the mass profile before it has a chance to flow and compare that to theoretical predictions. I can then remove the buckets and replace it with a clear-sided catchment box full of, in this case, plain pea gravel. And I can use colored pea gravel, in this case aquarium gravel, deposit it on here, and look at the geologic consequences of gravel on gravel placement. Because the sides are clear, then I can look at the erosional profile that occurs. Now I can replace the coarse gravel with fine gravel. In this case, I'm about to deposit fine red gravel on the fine blue gravel in the clear-sided catchment box. Now the advantage to using fine gravel is that the grain sizes are quite small compared to the size of the deposits we're making. One of the things we found with coarse gravel is that we weren't sure if our deposit was thick because it was actually thicker just because the grains were so large compared to the size of the thickness. So this is the advantage to using fine gravel. And then we measure the velocity of the ejecta curtain using this high-speed phantom video camera over here at the side that records the deposition process at 1,200 frames per second. We can then export those movies as individual frames and measure the speed. Now, the catapult does not simulate the entire ejecta deposit from a crater. It only simulates a small portion, such as here. Also, we can't assume that the catapult necessarily sits on the rim of the crater. Rather, the catapult is somewhere downrange of the imaginary crater rim. And in fact, before we did any experiments, we didn't even know what size of imaginary crater we were simulating. And so we had to figure that out after we had done some experiments. The way we did that, first of all, was to measure the velocity of the ejecta, both in flight and as it began to flow along the surface, using the exported frames from the high-speed video camera. Olivier and I wrote some custom MATLAB and IDL code to do this. The IDL code is really cool because it identifies individual grains, and then it computes its speed, first in pixels of displacement per frame, and we convert that to meters per second. And that and the velocity as a function of distance downrange from the catapult is plotted down here. And so this allows us then to measure that E value, that ratio between sliding kinetic energy to the curtain kinetic energy by looking at these values here. When we take all these measurements, we're then able to plot the velocity of our curtain ejecta here, where velocity is plotted on the y-axis, as a function of distance from the catapult or from the imaginary crater rim. And when we fit it to the predicted values from theory, we get a good fit when we assume a crater with a radius of 6 meters, and the catapult is situated 0.16 meters from the rim. So from a velocity perspective, we're simulating a 6-meter radius crater on Earth. Now what we also need is the physical size of the ejecta deposit on the ground. The relevant length parameter here is this footprint, this width of the curtain as it's depositing itself on the surface. Now, the theory that's been partially developed by Jim Richardson and others shows that when you plot the footprint as a function of distance from the crater, the curtain should be between 0.3 and 0.4 crater radii thick. That's a substantial fraction of the curtain width. When we take this scaling of 0.3 and we apply it to our measured footprint value of 13 centimeters, we're showing that our crater is only 43 centimeters in radius. This is still larger than craters that are possible to be made in laboratory experiments, but it is smaller than the velocity crater. Now when we measure the mass profile by placing the buckets downrange and weighing the gravel in each bucket after the shot, and actually taking that and converting it into not just mass, but mass per unit area, we see that we get a good fit to theory for a range of conditions here compared to a natural crater for a crater of size 3 meters in radius. So again, still not the same size as before. Ideally, these would all be the same size. Now, we do note that the data fall off steeply here. This is simply because our catapult is not infinitely tall and we don't have an infinitely tall ejecta curtain, but we're working hard on fixing that. The edge of the representative curtain is just the most distal point that happens to fall along the curve predicted from theory. Now, having different sized craters for velocity versus footprint versus mass can be kind of gotten around by calculating the pi2 parameter, this gravity scaled velocity, or inverse of the Froude number if you like. Now every planet has its own pi2 curve versus distance from the crater. This is the curve for Earth. And regardless of the size of crater we're talking about, whether it's small or large that took out the dinosaurs, it would follow this line here because we've non-dimensionalized our data. And our data then plot along this curve right here, and we're able to simulate conditions 3 to 4 crater radii away from the rim. So let's revisit my research goals. The first has been to establish that the catapult accurately simulates a portion of the ejected curtain. I'll put a green check mark by that. I've done that. Based on that confidence, we can evaluate the geologic consequences of ejected emplacement. I'm going to start off first with qualitative descriptions of what I observed and follow that up with more quantitative observations. So the ejecta is ejected from the imaginary crater here. It follows a ballistic path. The curtain flies along here and deposits itself here. Now let's zoom in on this blue box here, shown here. The particles in the ejected curtain reach a maximum velocity and hence kinetic energy right before impact. They strike the ground, they bounce, they reach some maximum bounce height, some distance uprange of the deposition front, and then they fall back down and they bounce and roll and come to a stop. And you can see that qualitatively in the movie here. What I've also noticed qualitatively is that distal regolith grains, in this case plain colored gravel, become energetically mobilized, almost like saltation, like from Aeolian geology, on ballistic paths. And you can see these plain regolith grains caught up in the ejecta, the pink ejecta flow here and here from these video stills. And then after the dust settled, I also noticed them and photographed them in this downrange catchment bucket beyond the edge of the clear-sided catchment box here. So ejecta is capable of mobilizing regolith grains. Now, taking images through the side of the clear target box after replacement for both fine gravel and coarse gravel experiments, we see notable examples of exhumation of the blue regolith. You can see some blue grains that have been exhumed here and incorporated into the ejecta flow. Here's a plain grain that got incorporated into the colored ejecta flow here. And we'll also note that some of the ejecta grains, the red grains, became implanted below the erosional surface down here. So we're seeing quite a bit of exhumation and gardening. There's also regolith shearing at depth. I noticed this fairly late in the game. If you compare before and after images, you'll note that if I park my cursor over one grain, you can see the whole thing is shearing downrange as we've emplaced the ejecta from left to right on top of here. So ejecta placement appears to be able to affect geology at depth. Again, this shearing is reminiscent from the situation at Reese Crater, where we have the striated contact surface, zoom in shown here, and these lateral detachment faults that show sliding away from the crater. The amount of energy available to do work and erosion and runout after landing, this is that E is the ratio again between the kinetic energy of the sliding ejecta to the curtain ejecta, is fairly high. Between 1/4 and 36% of that original kinetic energy is still around and able to do work after it's initially hit. So again, just emphasizing the point that ejecta does not stay put once it's deposited. Now I can, of course, map the topography of the erosional contact surface to the clear side of the target box here. And I can measure the depth of erosion, and because I know the dimensions of the box, I can get the volume of eroded blue material, and I know the bulk density, so I can get the mass, and that gives me the eroded mass, big M. Now, because I've previously done these bucket experiments, and I know the mass profile, I can ratio that to the amount of emplaced mass, giving me the erosive efficiency. This technique also allows me to map the overall topography of the ejecta deposit and the erosional contact surface here. I can then plot that erosive efficiency along with the type velocity brethren on this log-log plot of erosive or cratering efficiency as a function of pi2. We saw this plot at the beginning of this portion of the talk. Now the data for the ejected erosion experiments does indeed plot down here. This is consistent with predictions from the power laws shown here, but it lies off these lines. Now, these experiments are hypervelocity impacts into a liquid. These experiments are monolithic impactors between 1 to 6 kilometers per second into sand. These are data from buckshot experiments from Pete Schultz and Don Galt. where instead of a monolithic impactor, it was literally a cloud of buckshot into the ground at around the same velocities, but because it had a bigger footprint, it has a larger pi2 value plotting down here. So our data show that between 2 to 4% of the ejecta's mass gets eroded from the regolith. This isn't as efficient as hypervelocity impacts, but it's still pretty significant. We're showing that ejecta deposition, which you may think of as a sedimentary depositional process, also is fairly erosional. Now, when we look at our data here, which have a pi2 value of around 0.1, and we consider these buckshot experiments, which kind of follow the power law, but there's a fair bit of scatter in the data, it may begin to suggest this transitional regime between impact cratering and ejecta emplacement. We may be seeing a power law, like a rollover in the power law between these buckshot experiments at hypervelocity regime and granular ejecta emplacement experiments down here. Or we may be seeing a new power law that may connect these values through here. A large contribution to my PhD has been to start to fill in this part of the plot for ejecta emplacement at slow speeds. But what this opens up is new questions as to what these values are in here, and if we can come up with some scaling relations for these more granular processes. So there's future work to be done outside the scope of my PhD. Now to begin to compare the ejecta results to landslides, we need to measure the runout length, the runout length L. That's where the ejecta lands, again, to where it stops sliding. And again, we're using the edge of the representative mass curtain here as the distance from which we start measuring that. We're going to take that as the distance where the curtain lands. Now we need to find out how far it flowed after landing. This red ejecta was deposited in this direction. The catapult's down here somewhere. But where are you going to draw that line? We needed some clear criteria to be able to determine the distal extent of the ejecta runout. I chose a value of 50% of where I literally had a program count pixels of red, and where that red value dropped to 50% of the total amount, I took that as the edge of the ejecta runout. Again, here's a perspective view, and we're able now to use that ejecta runout L, combined with Earth's gravity and the velocity of the emplacement ejected to get this runout efficiency 1 over R. I should also mention as a point that this is also the reciprocal of the coefficient of friction. So when we plot those data for the erosion experiments, for the runout experiments, plot down in here at volumes of about 10 to the minus 11th cubic kilometers. And we'll note that these runout efficiencies of between 2 and almost 4 are the same as these much larger naturally occurring landslides of both Earth and Mars that have orders of at least 12 orders of magnitude higher volume, so 1 trillion times more volume for 1 cubic kilometer size runout events. So this is encouraging. What this tells us is that in the laboratory, we're able to create dynamically similar runout regimes that are similar to what we observe in nature. So the conceptual model that I can develop at this point, first of all, it says you can't assume a negative power law 3 slope and go from there. Rather, as the ejecta curtain deposits itself, some of these grains implant themselves below the erosional contact surface, and other energetic ejecta grains can mobilize regolith particles, shown here in these brown lines here. And so if we zoom out and look at the overall distribution, there's a very heterogeneous erosional contact surface from the ejecta scour. Grains have been implanted below the contact surface, and some of the regolith grains have been exhumed to be incorporated with and sometimes sit atop the ejecta here. There's also an incredible amount of shearing going on at depth down here, which can affect subsurface stratigraphy. And this distal saltation may be responsible for the creation of these dune-like features that have been observed on ejecta deposits on the Moon and on Mercury. Applying these scaling results now to a more concrete example, I'm going to use the example of one of my favorite craters on the Moon, Giordano Bruno. It's a 22-kilometer diameter simple crater on the lunar far side. The catapult simulates this pink portion right here, some distance from the crater rim. In fact, it's about 33 kilometers from the crater rim. From the ejecta scaling results, we predict that a 2.8 kilometer thick wall of debris, we're talking an avalanche from the sky, impacts the ground at 300 meters per second. If that right, or if that's around Mach 1. It forms a 33 meter thick pile of debris that then thins substantially as it slides out for 23 kilometers to its final resting place over here. During its runout, it's going to erode the subsurface down about 1 to 2 meters from the pre-impact surface, and material down to half a kilometer at depth can be sheared by as much as 11 meters distantly away from the crater. So this is a highly dynamic, highly violent process, separate from the actual cratering event itself. And so my conclusions for this part of my talk is that we have a new method to study ejecta. I've shown that the catapult accurately reproduces an ejecta curtain such that we have confidence that the laboratory ejecta is dynamically similar to what we think occurs in nature. Ejecta runout is highly energetic and comparable to landslides. Ejecta is also highly erosive, in addition to also being depositional. And we can also use this to constrain the range of transport histories possible for samples from the moon we have in the lab, for interpreting remote sensing data sets, and for stratigraphic interpretations. Kind of the final overview of my entire dissertation is that Mars is an Aeolian planet like Earth, but with a twist. Mars may be currently destroying its own sand dunes, forming sand sheets, and this could be driven by chaotic climate change. We have a new method for studying ejecta emplacement that can inform transport histories, and we've seen useful similarities to impact experiments and landslides. Now I'd like to acknowledge my wonderful co-advisors, Bruce Marsh, Nathan Bridges, and Olivier Barnouin. I've wanted to get a PhD in something space-related since high school, and so they've allowed my dream to come true. Assuming they pass me after this. I'd like to thank my EPS friends, EPS faculty and staff, the APL SRE folks, the Space Exploration Group at APL. A lot of people have taken it upon themselves to make me their unofficial mentee, and I've appreciated that. I'd like to thank my church community, many of which are whom here today. Appreciate you coming. I'd like to thank God for getting to literally play in his cosmic sandbox. My family, Dan and Renee Runyon, of course the APL Graduate Student Fellowship that has paid for my graduate education, which I very much appreciated. Finally, today is the 1-year anniversary to the day of the passing of my grandfather, E. Harold Munn Jr. He was my inspiration for going into science in the first place. And defending on this day is, I think, a wonderful way to honor his memory. And so I dedicate this thesis to him. I'd be happy to take your questions now. Thank you. Dana.
So you talked about the regolith shearing. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what depth that's actually occurring, and then does that actually happen only under the footprint of the ejector, or does that could potentially extend beyond that?
All I can show from my experiments is that it happens underneath the ejecta, and all we can show from field mapping at Reese Crater is that it happens under the ejecta. The amount of shearing decreases with depth. The catchment box where I did the experiments is 10 centimeters thick, and toward the bottom of that 10 centimeters, the shearing had kind of petered out. So that 11 meters of shear for the case of Giordano Bruno, that's near the surface, and that decreases with depth to about 1 meter of shear, about 500 meters down. Yeah, Daniel.
Do you see brecciation, on examples of Earth impacts, deposits surrounding them, do you see brecciation which might signify this shear that you're talking about from the experiment?
So if you're correct, we'd expect these breccia lenses, like the Reese Crater. There is a lot of brecciation. I don't know specifically offhand. There obviously is lots of brecciation, especially from impact melt. That's one of the caveats from our experiment, is that we're not able to simulate the effects of impact melt. So I haven't seen any breccia in the lab. We don't do anything that would simulate that. Bruce could tell you more about terrestrial deposits for brecciation.
The bigger the crater, the more breccia. Like Sudbury, everything's breccia.
Okay, everything's a breccia.
And are there sort of breccia deposits underlying what you know is the mobilized ejecta? Like, for example, the Chesapeake impact is being drilled, right? Do you see that in the core?
I don't know offhand. I'm fairly certain we would see that, though.
Yeah.
I think you definitely see brecciation.
Okay, thank you. Kevin?
So, going back to the Aeolian portion of the talk, I think this leapfrogging model of sand sheets and dunes is interesting, but I'm not sure how to reconcile that with two things: that you must have eventual flux out of the system through grinding these particles down to dust, and the fact that a lot of these, like you showed, these dark splotches in, for instance, the Arabia craters are pretty well localized in the downstream portions of impact craters. And so it's hard for me to imagine that the dune fields every 100,000 years are changing positions. Is that what you actually envision, or?
No, not completely. So yes, there is sinks to the system such that is forming the paleo or indurating sand sheets. That can be an exit to the system. I'm not suggesting the whole field reforms itself every 100,000 years. it may pick up where it left off. I understand the details of the leapfrog model may be incorrect, but I think the power is the idea of a self-sourcing sand dune field that moves downwind. That's what I'm more likely to hang my hat on. Now, the question is still, where did that sand ultimately come from upwind in the first place? I haven't attempted to answer that at this point, but I think this partially solves the mystery of where that sand came from. In terms of the Arabia Terra, I'm not sure.
In other words, I guess, yeah, do you imagine that these dune fields are changing position over time?
Yes, so in a few 100,000 years, the whole dune field would be in a different spot. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
That's what I see, that's what my data show.
Okay.
Anna?
Yeah, along those lines, if I got your numbers right, the timescale seems to be that these dunes are moving by about 1 meter per year.
Yeah.
And the length of the field where you have the dunes is only about 2,000 or 3,000 meters. So that would imply
About 10 kilometers.
But that would imply a timescale that's much shorter than the orbital timescales. right?
Sure, I'm not saying, yeah.
So do you think that things like sandstorms or are maybe dumping a whole bunch of sand upwind, and then as it gets collected, it ends up in the dunes
The
first?
second part of your question, I kind of doubt that the storms we see on Mars are more dust storms. They're not sandstorms. We're definitely suspending dust. But that's not going to contribute to the overall sand dune, sand sheet morphology and flux.
So on a timescale of a few thousand years, unless the whole thing started off at the edge of the crater and then moves down, right?
Mhm.
So the sand front itself is moving. It doesn't seem to me like you have enough time to do what you want to do.
Yeah, I'm not proposing that everything happens in one obliquity cycle.
Mm.
It can pick up where it left off. On my sine curve there, after we go through that induration period, the ice retreats from the equatorial areas, and we're in the same spot as we are now. So it can, where diagenesis hasn't happened, the bedforms can pick up where they left off. So things aren't limited to the times. The overall formation and migration is not limited to the time scale within one obliquity cycle. That's what I'm trying to say. Nate?
So these interobliquity cycles, when you're actually forming these flat sand sheets, is there a limiting factor where there's sort of a hysteresis loop in the cycle where the topography that you sort of say modulates the underlying shear stress, eventually that should become flat, right? If you're having more or less the same shear stress across, and after many cycles you're just getting flatter and flatter topography. Does it work that way?
I'm not quite sure I understand your question. Now, once you have a flat, I'm not sure I understand your question, but where you have flat ground, you wouldn't expect any more wind shear stress after that, after it's adjusted to that initial slope. And so you wouldn't predict any deviation from, say, a power law decrease from the internal boundary layer at that point. Then wherever you do get slopes, you would compress lines. But I'm not sure I understood your hysteresis question, or...
So it's more the long-term cycles on how, so maybe I misunderstood this. So in your diagenesis cycle, that's when you're forming these sheets, right? And I guess creating longer term topography. So
Okay.
what is maybe the not simpler question, but more concise question is, what longer term topography does your leapfrogging cycle predict? Like, what is the limit of that? Because it seems to me that it would eventually become pretty flat.
Okay, I'm still having trouble
We
understanding.
can talk about this after.
Okay, I mean, we're definitely forming smooth, I think we are forming smooth topography of the smooth unit. For example, the Stimson Formation at Gale Crater shows preserved, probably dunes in outcrop. I haven't seen evidence for that in many areas on Mars, so I'm not saying that diagenesis is instantly like petrifying an entire dune right off the bat.
Well, no, I'm not. Would it preferentially preserve the flatter surfaces?
Most likely, I don't know, but could be. Yeah, Mariah?
So my question kind of has to do with what Kevin was asking about. And so stop me if I'm wrong, but you were saying that you thought that the flux of the ripples should be different, correct, to the flux of the dunes themselves?
the ripple flux will be a component of the total flux.
Okay, but you were talking about how one was just representative of rotation and creep, and the other was including saltation. And I guess, for me, then you found, right, that the fluxes were actually very similar?
Yes.
Okay, so I would think that actually all three mechanisms were happening in both cases, but if you could, so I guess I'm wondering, first off, why you think that there's no saltation occurring in
I'm not saying that at all.
Okay,
I'm saying that the saltation is not manifested as a bed form.
okay,
So the saltation is occurring because you need that to drive the reptation.
yeah,
But it's not manifesting itself as a dune on top of the sand sheet.
I see, so you can't quantify it? Is that,
I think you can quantitatively estimate it,
because if the sediment's still moving,
yes.
then there's obviously going to be a difference in the bed form the second time you look at it, even if the grains have saltated away. True? So it'll be part of the actual flux.
I'm not sure if I understood that second part of your question, but by measuring the ripple flux, that's a component of the flux.
Yeah.
And then knowing the ratio, that's going to give us the total flux over the sand sheet, including saltation. But because the advancement of slip faces gives us a measurement of total flux for dunes, we don't have that capability, that measurement capability, short of in situ measurements for sand sheets. I don't know if that gets at answering your question.
Okay. I guess a little bit, but I guess what I was going to say was it might be interesting, and maybe this isn't possible if you're saying that you actually are taking account for saltation, but I could imagine, well, first of all, if there's a difference in do you know anything about the grain size populations in the sand sheets versus the dunes, or are you pretty much just assuming they're the same?
I'm assuming it's similar to Gale Crater, so.
Okay, but in terms of so basically I could imagine if a sand sheet is fueling a dune growth, then after some time the sand sheet will have lag deposits of the coarser grains that I'm sort of working with, which
Sure.
then in turn can't saltate, and the flux in the sand sheet will be lower than the dune. And then you could imagine that the dune then fuels, as you were talking about, becomes the source of the small sediment.
I don't see any evidence for lag deposits. I'm not
Okay.
saying it's not there.
Okay.
It's not something I can measure.
So you're assuming that the sand sheets are really the same size grains?
Yes,
as-
yes. So yes, I am assuming the same grain population.
Okay.
And that's because we see the same type of ripple behavior in both dunes and sheets.
Okay.
If there are no further questions, we'll excuse everyone except the faculty.